Okay, my name is Sara Smith-Silverman. My pronouns are she, her, hers. I'm a professor of history at American River College, and today's date is September 20th, 2023. So let's start off by establishing the basics. What's your full name? What are your pronouns? And what's your date of birth?
My name is Linh. My pronouns are she, her, hers, and I was born in January 2006.
How old does that make you?
I am 17.
So tell me a little about yourself. What are your interests and hobbies? What do you like to do?
I'm a student at CRC. I like to run. I was a cross country runner in middle school through high school, and I did track as well, but I prefer cross country. Um, I some other hobbies I have are running. Oh, running. I also like to draw, um, listen to music, and watch anime and other shows. And I also like to read a lot.
What kind of books do you like to read?
I like reading a lot of books, except nonfiction, but I can read from like comedy, romance to like thriller, paranormal. I'm currently reading a book called it's the nightclub, or I think the club on Telegraph, um, something about a telegraph, but it's a queer book, and I think that's kind of fitting for this.
So where did you grow up and where do you live now?
I've always grown up in this Sacramento area. I lived in Pocket area, and then now I live in Elk Grove, and I've been living here for like the past 7, 8 years.
Where do you currently attend college and what do you study?
I go to Smith-River College, and I plan to transfer to a UC and study neuroscience.
How long have you been at CRC?
I took one semester over the summer, but this is my first semester on campus.
Did you graduate early from high school?
No, I just skipped a grade. I skipped second grade, but it wasn't that big of a jump. So I'm just younger than like a lot of people.
Are you a part-time student or a full-time student?
I'm a full-time student.
So why did you choose to go to CRC?
I chose it because um, not only did I get rejected from a lot of the schools that I applied to, and I was like, okay, now I have to rethink this. And my brother, older brother, he's older by 1 year. He goes to CRC, and so he has this path as well. He's planning to transfer to another school, and so that was like an option that was open to me. And we looked at my family looked at the tag program, so we thought, oh, that's a good option, especially because it goes to these UCs that have good neuroscience programs. So, and I also think it's not only is it better financially, I'm also because it's the medical field, it's gonna be a long like path. So saving money earlier, I can like sort of map out my course, and if I want to go somewhere else, it's easier. I feel like to switch when I'm at like a lower level and like lower intensity, so I'm not like stuck.
What UC are you hoping to attend?
UC Irvine, and if not, maybe UC Davis.
And what's so good about UC Irvine?
Um, I looked at their neuroscience program, so I thought that was cool. And I went to both campuses I visited. They're both nice, so I don't think I'd have a problem with either. I'm not very picky with like where I am, but yeah.
So can you tell me about how you identify with regard to your social identities broadly speaking? So race, ethnicity, sexuality, gender, religion, disabilities, and so on?
I identify as Vietnamese. Both my parents are. um, and I identify as queer, and I don't really. I know labels help like a lot of people, but for me, it's a little difficult because I'm like it's hard for me to look at myself and think, okay, what is this like compared to other people? How do I actually feel? And sometimes it's a little confusing, so I'm fine with just saying queer. Um, so I think I somewhere on the ace spectrum and a romantic, but I'm not sure exactly where. I'm probably somewhere on the bi spectrum.
So, any disabilities, mental health issues? You have a religious identification?
Um, I don't really have like a religious identification. My family's not super religious. We're just culturally Buddhist. It's like some of the traditions, but we're not like very religious. We don't go out to maybe like the temple or anything as often as some other people.
And no disabilities or mental health?
No.
Okay. So, are you an immigrant or are your parents immigrants?
My parents immigrated here from Vietnam when they were like younger, so they were like still kids, and my grandparents came, but I was born here.
So, you said you're probably ace, maybe on the aromantic spectrum. So, would you mind elaborating a little bit on what that means to you, how you came to that conclusion?
Um, I I was spending a lot of time on YouTube, social media, and I see like all these queer people making videos, and I see, oh, I was just watching for like I didn't even like identify with all of these, but I just watched it and I was like, oh, that's cool. Learn a little bit about them. It was fun. And it was also me not wanting to do other stuff. But, and then I saw some ace stuff and I was like, oh, that might be me actually, because I don't like, I guess when I also talk, I hear some things from other people, I read a lot, and so I see all these people with like these feelings. They say, oh, this is how I feel when I saw this person for the very first time. I fell in love instantly, or I want sexual gratification with them. And I never realized that until recently that I never really felt that way. I never saw someone and said, I want to be in a relationship with you right now. I don't know how other people really feel. I don't know if that's actually how they feel or if they've been like, that's how they've been conditioned to think. But um, yeah.
Well, I can sympathize with that. The idea of sort of instant attraction, or like I know that you're somebody that I want to be with. That's something that I do not identify with. But so, do you think there are any misconceptions about what it means to be ace and what it means to be on the aromantic spectrum?
Yeah, I think so there's like a spectrum like the name says.
All right, so can you talk a little bit about your coming out experience? What was the process like of figuring out your identities? I know you talked about it a little bit already, but have you come out to people around you, friends, family, so on?
So it was a interesting experience. So my best friend, who's a girl, she like um, she uses she they pronouns, and she was also like questioning, and then so she was talking to me about it, and we like talk about everything, and we she ended up telling me, oh, I really like you, and then I was like, oh, okay, how do I feel about this, and like what am I thinking? And so eventually we started dating, but then we didn't like come out to anyone. And so it was like maybe 4 months, and it was like pretty low key because we've like been like we're like she's my closest friend, so it's not like strange that we spent time together. But then we're like, okay, do want to like let people know and not have to like hide it. So we decided, okay, today we're gonna like tell our parents. Is like that gonna work? And so I wrote like a whole letter, and I was going to. I think I just like brought the letter downstairs, and then I was like, okay, we were done with dinner, and we're going to watch a movie, and as I'm cleaning the table, I was like, okay, we're like at a point where we're not really doing anything, so this is the perfect time. So I was just like, okay, I had to like tell you guys something. I didn't. I just said that I was queer, and I was like, okay, and I'm dating my friend, and they're like, oh, okay. My parents reacted in different ways. Uh, I started crying because I was like, even though I already like read it, like practiced reading it before, and I was like, okay, no, I'll be fine. And then I start like tearing up a little bit, and I was like, oh my gosh. And um, my mom was very supportive, and then she was like, oh, okay, like I'm sorry you had to like hide it for so long. I wish you could have like just told us at the start, because in my household, communication's like a really big thing, and we've like um, yeah, we've talked about like, oh yeah, we should communicate better. Um, and then my dad was, he was like silent and he didn't like really, I think it was just a completely new thing for him. And then he was oh, like this is so radical and like this is just hitting so close. It's not like, I don't know, maybe like a cousin or someone. It's like, it's my daughter. And so he had to think for a while, and then he was like, I don't know, like, are you sure? Like, what are you talking about? And I was really like scared when I was reading the thing. I was shaking before it, and then but then after like having it out, it felt really relieving. And over time, my both my parents like got used to it, and like my dad got like better about like, oh, okay, like this is not like some sort of strange thing. It's not like, I don't know, so different, and like I don't know. And then because we took my girlfriend to a family camping trip, and that was like the first time that like he saw us together after we came out, and that just really like, oh, they're still acting normally. They're not like doing anything strange. I think that really helped him like see that it's just like any other relationship, but he's known her for a long time too, so like he knows who she is and everything. And she came out to her parents on the same night, and they were both fine. They said okay, and she was like, "There's nothing. Like it was just okay." And so that was good. Um, and so school was still in session. We were seniors in high school, and we started like slowly coming out to our friends. And then it was really funny because I told one of my friends, saying, in the middle of biology class, we were just like working on ourselves. Like, hey, so I'm dating her. And then my friends was like, really? Like, because I said I just have sometimes sound sarcastic or like I'm joking, but it was good. And all of our friends are really supportive. We pulled aside like one of our mutual like close friends who's also queer, and then we're like, oh yeah, we know he's gonna be supportive and everything. And so it was like really fun to see everyone's reactions. But it was a pretty good experience overall, and we didn't like really like go on social media and say like post something. It was just like, oh, okay, we just want to let like our close friends know. And then I just have like a rainbow pin on like my backpack and stuff. Like I don't really go out and say like, oh, hey everyone, but it's just like I feel like it's a nice symbol to like let other people know, like, oh, okay, she's either an ally or she's queer. And I think that's nice to always see people so you like feel safer around them or just maybe want to strike up a conversation. Yeah.
So why do you think it was important for you to share that you're queer with your parents?
Well, I was talking to my girlfriend about it, and then she didn't want to like hide it because it's been 4 months, and then it feels kind of weird to like go around and pretend like it's like doesn't kind of exist, and then even though it like changed some things about like us hanging out together, it's like, okay, now that it's out there, we can just like deal with the obstacles as it comes instead of like tiptoeing around it and then like being super secretive about everything.
So are there so you didn't mention, I think, to your family that you're maybe on the ace spectrum, maybe aromantic, or ace and maybe on the aromantic spectrum. Is there a reason why you didn't reveal that part?
Um, I feel like it's a little weird to talk about like, oh, I don't feel like really strong sexual attraction. To say that to my parents. Um, and I think like that's private-ish. And I just wanted to say on this interview so that way other people can like see representation of that because I had a friend, or I have a friend, who's on the A spectrum, and when I mentioned that to her, she was like, "Oh, wait, me too." And I was like, "Really?" And she felt so. She said, "I've like never met anyone in person who I know who's actually like ace or something." And I was like, "Oh, that's like, it's really validating to see someone else like." Even if it's like online, but it's even like better if it's in person because you're like, oh, that's a real person. That's not some like figure 2D figure online that you just like, oh, okay, that's cool. But yeah.
So are there certain circumstances in which you feel like you would rather not be out as queer? Or to certain people, you'd rather not be out as queer?
Um, I'm not like out to like the rest of my family, like aunts, uncles really. Some have found like my both my parents said, we're fine with you telling whoever, but so everyone on my mom's side like immediately like grandma, grandpa, and then like um aunts and uncles, they all know. We also went on the camping trip with my grandparents on my mom's side. Um, but on my dad's side, I know they're more like against that. And then I can hear them talking at family gatherings, and I know, like, okay, I kind of know how they feel about that. And it's just kind of uncomfortable in a way. Some of my aunts on that side know because of, like, because they talked to, like, my brother, and he found out. And then I, like, told some of my cousins just because we were talking about, like, everything, so.
Without naming names, but are there people in your family who are also queer you can relate to now that you're out?
Um, Recently I went on like a trip and I went to visit some family. And my mom mentioned before that there's like I had like an aunt who's queer, and I didn't know who she was. And then after we were done with the trip, she was like, "Oh yeah, let me show you her Facebook page," and showed like her and her girlfriend. And I was like, "Wait, she's the like family member that you were talking about? I didn't know that." But I think there's like a couple, but I don't really like know.
It's nice if there are people in your family who are also queer.
Yeah.
um, I keep thinking for my own family, one of you must be queer. Nobody's coming out.
There's too many people. I do have like a younger cousin who's queer, and my mom told me about her. And I was like, oh, I didn't know that. I thought she was already queer, but I didn't like know for certain until my mom told me, and I was like, oh, that's cool that she told her parents and stuff.
Maybe by being out yourself in your family, or at least out to a lot of people in your family, that will make it more welcoming and like feel safer for your you'll feel safer for your cousin maybe.
Yeah, my mom mentioned that once my cousin's mom found out like that I'm also queer, she was like, "Oh, maybe it won't be as bad to like that like maybe my cousin's grandparents can like know because of my grandparents who do know." And so I think it does help because it like especially like telling like older generations, I feel like it's like it's also very stigmatized because like I think she only told like her mom and her dad, and they're like hesitant about like telling, I don't know, the grandparents or any other family members.
So do you think being Vietnamese shapes what it means to be queer and what it means to be out in your family? Or
Um, I don't know if this is like a Vietnamese thing or a like Asian cultural thing or maybe just my family, but I think it has like I don't know, my parents always told me like, oh, no dating until you're like 16. And then so I was like, okay. And I guess I never realized I didn't really feel like romantic attraction super strongly. And so I was like, oh no, I can't date. Sorry. It's my parents' policy. And I guess that kind of like, I don't know if that was from the way I was raised to not really like get into any relationships until I was older, or if that was just who I like, how I always felt. But I don't know. So I think that's like the way that my parents raised sort of like affected me. Um, and I guess I was always more um, felt more open to like make friends with girls rather than guys because I'm like, oh yeah, no, I don't feel as comfortable, or I just like relate more to the girls, and so I always just had like all my closest friends were like girls. Like I have a couple like friends who are guys, but generally, I guess I just like built such a strong relationship with my best friend that she became my girlfriend in the end. But I just feel more comfortable like doing that with her.
do you think, I mean, maybe this is a difficult question to answer because you know your family best, but in Vietnamese culture, what does it mean broadly to be queer? Like, do you think being queer folks are accepted in Vietnamese culture communities, or is it complicated? Like,
I think it's like not talked about. I don't really see a lot of uh, representation. Um, and like nobody really talks about it. Maybe like they mention like, oh yeah, these gay people, they're like doing stuff or this and that. I don't really like listen to that, but I know that they like I don't know mention it every now and then. But it's I feel like that's just like my family members or some of them who just like not very like open or they just haven't like thought about it like that, and so I just don't see a lot of representation, but I do feel like really validated when I see online. I saw like there's a queer Vietnamese girl and I was like, oh my gosh, that's like me, and she's like a teenager, and so I was like that's so cool to see someone else.
what about representation broadly, like in Hollywood, movies, TV? Do you see any representation of Asian American queer people?
Um Recently I watched the movie Everything Everywhere All at Once, and um, the daughter is queer, and they're I believe they're Chinese, but it was very surprising because all I heard about the movie was that it's like it's deep and it's so crazy and there's all this cinematography that I just went in thinking, oh okay, that's all, and I feel like just like it was like part of the plot, was that she was queer, and so it wasn't like completely sidelined, but it wasn't like the main focus, making a huge deal out of it. And I was like, oh my gosh, she's queer, she's Asian. That's really interesting. That's cool to see. But I do think that a lot of times representation is not of people of color who are queer, and it's like, okay, like that's really nice to see, but then when you see someone who you can identify with, it just feels so much better because you know it's not just some like group off to the side that's very like in their whole world, and you're just here like, I can't really go there, can I? And then you see people of color who are also queer, and you just feel like, okay, these are my people. I can like relate to them like about other things other than being queer, like just like family, culture, and stuff.
Okay, so we're in the education section now, and I'd like to start with this big, rather big question. So, can you talk some about your educational journey from high school to the present?
I just graduated recently, so it's not really much, but I guess starting from maybe middle school to high schoolish, I've always like, I think it's I don't know if it was like from my parents, but they always like, they know like, okay, you're a smart kid, you can like take like whatever classes. And I just like, okay, I'll just take, honors classes. I like kind of didn't have a reason like in middle school. It was just like, I'll just take it, I guess. Like I can do it. It's not like bad. So I've just always been taking like, try like pushing myself and like taking like more difficult classes. In high school, I continued that, and then I took like a couple AP classes, but that was also over distance learning, so it was a very interesting experience. And then my high school was an IB school, so we had like a couple AP, but a lot of IB classes, which is International Baccalaureate, and so those classes basically they take 2 years to complete, and it's a commitment because and at the end of the 2 years there's an exam, and then if you take that exam similar to the AP exam, you can get like college credits and stuff. But it's a little strange because they it's some of them like you don't like get as much credit, or it like doesn't count for like certain things, even though it's like the level of rigor is you have 2 years of this really in-depth topic that you're learning about, and you could take an AP class and just do it for like a year or something. um, but I took those IB classes. It was it's been really interesting. um, I was part of like the IB um, diploma program, which means you had to take like a certain amount. I think it was like 6 IB classes through like a certain thing, and there was a whole program. There's a lot of essays and stuff, and then I ended up dropping out of that one and went like down like a level, but it's still like IB. I think so, associate's results, um, and so I think I only had to take like 5, which was a lot better for me, and I think it really helped me. It was very interesting classes in general. Maybe like the work, it was kind of a lot, but I think I learned a lot from it. And I think these classes I helped prepare me for college. And so once I started taking like over the summer, I took English 300, and it kind of felt like easier than like any of my other high school classes, like my English in high school. It was like different, maybe like easier in some ways, harder in some ways, but it was more fun. I feel like it felt like there's a lot more freedom in the classes at college, and it's so much more interesting because I took a LGBT studies class, and that was um, like that's like not really a course you find in high school, and so it was like, this is so novel, it's so interesting, and I mean, like you write essays or like maybe like a slideshow, but it's about something that's actually interesting. It felt like so. I really enjoyed like my classes over the summer, even though it was like a lot of work because I took like three, and maybe that was a bit much over for like a summer, but I think it like helped prepare me for like classes, like what the experience is like, what teachers are like in college versus like high school, um, and so now I'm taking I think 17 units, um, and like some of them I thought it would be like the same level as like my high school when I was taking like those like six IB classes, which were like really hard for me. I think it prepared me for this because now it's like, okay, these all have like their hard parts, but also like some of this stuff is already review, or like I know like how to like do this. I know I have these skills already, so but I'm not like very far into my college experience, so still gonna work through it.
Are you worried that you're not going to be challenged enough? Like, do you ever worry that it's not the classes you're taking are going to prepare you well enough for transferring?
Um, I think it'll be okay because I've seen like the requirements for tag for a UC, and there's for biology. There's a lot of science classes I'm gonna have to take. Like because I didn't take any chemistry in high school, I'm in Chem 300 now, which is like the intro to Chem, and it's really fun. Honestly, it's interesting. I think it's probably easier than if I took Chem in high school for some things. Um, but there's gonna be a lot more. I think I have like four more semesters of chemistry alone because it's biology related. So I expect like I think it's gonna prepare me pretty well. I do sometimes worry like, what if the things that I learned here aren't like the exact same at like the school I'm gonna transfer to? But I think there's enough like on the internet, I guess, to help. I can always like find things. I can always like ask for like tutoring. So I think I'll be okay overall.
Did you ever struggle in your classes in high school?
Um, yes, I think the most was probably in my math, which is ironic because I like math. Um, but like I think it was pre-calculus. It was also over distance learning, so that like made me struggle a bit because I like couldn't really like maybe ask other people for help as much, and it was just it was a little hard. But I think overall I just try working hard a lot, and then my parents always like they try and help me even if they haven't like taken the course. They'll like help me like look it up online and say, okay, I think I found like how to solve this problem. Or and for other things, um like I think like English, I like, oh, do you think like this intro paragraph is better or this one? And so they do help me. um but overall I think I just, if I pay attention in class, I think a lot of my classes are um like I didn't like struggle that bad. I think it was more of the workload that I struggled with rather than the content itself. Um, except like history was a little hard because I don't like enjoy like I don't really like history as much. So taking like higher level like classes of history was difficult. But I mean I think it helped me in the end.
So, were any of your classes in high school inclusive of queer or trans experiences?
Um, I not in high school, like not really like talked about. There's no like specific courses or anything. Um, I think the most like related to queerness at in the high school was probably like our club, GSA. But yeah, there was like nothing really in like the curriculum.
What high school did you go to?
Laguna Creek High School.
So were you involved in the GSA in high school?
I was not. I wanted to join, but I was like at cross country, and that's like my love and commitment. So I spent a lot of time doing that, and I didn't join the club. But the most I see is like on we have like a Pride Week, and then they have like a table that they set up. I just like stop by there, but that's only like once a year, so I don't really spend a lot of time doing that.
Are there a lot of queer students who were in cross track? Wait, what is it called? Running?
Yeah, cross country.
Cross country.
um, I there's like a amount. I met my girlfriend through cross country in middle school, but um, I know there's like a couple other queer people who I have met who are in cross country. Uh, I mean, I don't think. I mean, I didn't know for some of them until like someone else told me, like, oh yeah, like he's bi actually, and I was like, oh, I did not know that. But I know someone who's like very open and like always wears like rainbow stuff, so I'm like, oh yeah, I know you're queer, but there's not like a huge amount, but it's not like non-existent.
Did you seek out queer friendships in high school?
Not really. I think it just like there's like a I was in art club and like a lot of the people there were queer, and so that was like such a fun place because I like art, and then like these are my friends and they're also queer, a lot of them, and I never really like was seeking out anything. I just like if you're my friend, you're my friend. Like in my freshman year, my closest friend came out to me as queer, and I was like, oh, like this is like the first person who's like really like close to me who like actually I knew who was queer, and I was like, oh, that's so cool. Um, but I never really like said, oh, like I want to like go to GSA meetings because I want to like meet queer people. I think a lot of people were open about it in a lot of my classes. Um, I guess either it was just like I just happened to be friends with them, or yeah, they just I did have like quite a bit of queer friends, I guess.
So you were out in high school?
Senior year.
Your senior year. Okay. So what do you think it was like for, well, what was it like for yourself and what was it like for other queer students at your high school?
I think it was very open. There's not like there's a lot of like supportive like teachers. Because of the Pride Week thing, the table they have like free stuff like stickers, and like one of the members like crocheted really cute stuff, and they also had like a bunch of pride flags that were like small, like maybe this big, and a lot of teachers like have like them in their classrooms, and so I always like smile when I see it, and I was like, oh, okay, I know like you're like a supportive teacher then, and there's a lot of students who are out, and so I think it's just really open because all around you like see, oh, they have like a pride pin, they're like very open about it. I think it's very welcoming at the school.
So do you remember if any of your classes were inclusive of Asian American experiences specifically?
I like I guess some of them it wasn't relevant, like math really, but in history, we had specific like a section. As part of the like the curriculum is like we learned about discrimination against like different groups at like this certain time period. Like it was one of the world wars, I believe, and Asian Americans was one of the groups, and so we learned about like the experiences, and then there was also the specifically like it was like in a different section was like the Japanese Americans, and also I guess some other Asian Americans during like World War II, I believe.
So upon reflection, when you think about how inclusive your curriculum was in high school, does it surprise you, or what do you think of the fact that your classes were largely not inclusive of queer experiences or topics?
I think it was just like the classes I was in was pretty like there's like a curriculum and then you just like kind of preparing for a test. At least that's how my classes have been for like the past couple of years. It was just like more for the exam, and so that way you get like whatever information you need to know, all these skills, and I guess like math, um, and English. There wasn't like a lot of like room maybe, but actually in English we had like movies that we watched and books that we had to read, which was part of like the curriculum. And now that I think about it, there was actually inclusive of like people of color. I think it was like it was a book about a girl from um, Iran, and it was actually really interesting culturally because like I had no idea really about like culture in that area, and so it was a book called Persepolis.
Oh, I read that. That's a great book.
Yeah, it was really interesting. I enjoyed it because also it's kind of fun because it's like a graphic novel, and so it was very different from like maybe past books that we've read, which are like Romeo and Juliet, which is very I don't know, just Eurocentric. So there was like it was cool. We saw a movie. It was called A Separation, but it was also about like people of color, and so it was like I think the film was in like a different language, and we just had to read the subtitles. I thought that was cool. It was fun to learn about. Um, but there's not a lot of like queer representation like in these like books, I guess. Um, and yeah.
So the summer before your first academic year in college, you decided to take Intro to LGBTQ Studies at ARC, right?
Yep.
Why did you choose to take that class?
Um, I was looking at like the requirements for transferring, and one of the like sections, it was one of the classes that are UC transferable, and it's satisfied a section that I still needed. So I was like, okay. I was just looking through what classes interested me, and I was like, okay, the class is open. I have like it's asynchronous, which is what I wanted over the summer because I didn't want to come in person. Um, so I was able to take that.
And how did you like that class?
I thought it was really fun, and it was interesting to see all the other people like through the discussion board. Um, but one of my favorite parts was like the end. It was like the final project. It was making artwork that's like related to like intersectional like identities and queerness. And so I like art, so it was fun because I hadn't like made the time to make art. So I was like, oh, perfect opportunity. Not only do I get credit for it as like a homework assignment, but it's also fun because I was like, okay, um, it's about my identity as like both Vietnamese and queer, and so it was really fun to make the artwork.
So why do you think it's important, or why does it feel personally meaningful to you to um, take a course like LGBTQ studies?
I think it was a good introduction, like especially if like you don't have a lot of like information in that area or you don't like maybe you've just never learned about it really. And to have it in like a formal like academic setting is going to be interesting because you get to discuss like certain things with other people and you get to read about it through like through the textbook and you say, okay, this is like what academically this is like what they're going to say about it. And then so it's like a nice like setting because sometimes it's hard to talk about like some things. So like you just avoid talking about it, like queerness. And so it's a good space to talk about it and like maybe learn about it. Maybe if you just want to learn a little more, maybe you just have to take the class for a like requirement. But I think it's fun because you get to learn about other people, and it's important to learn about other people's identities and like how they're gonna feel. So that, especially if you're not like part of the community, so that way you can be like just understanding of other people.
Were there certain topics you covered in that class that were new to you that you found particularly interesting?
Yeah, learning it was a lot about the history of like um queer people, and I've like heard of like the Stonewall riots and stuff, but I never actually knew what it was. And so we learned about that, and I was like, this is it's really interesting, and learned about like um we watched like a film called Screaming Queens. Um, that was very interesting because I didn't know about that. Like I just not like a very big history person, so I didn't know like any of this stuff. And it's cool to see like, you know, queer people have always existed, even if it's like way in the past, or maybe they didn't like have the words to describe it. It was interesting to see some of the terminology that changed. Um, but yeah, I enjoyed learning about like all the people and like specific figures who I like maybe heard the name in passing, but actually got to learn a little bit more.
So it seems like most students in high school and in college um, able, aren't really exposed to queer and trans topics in the classroom unless they decide to take a class like Intro to LGBTQ Studies. So why do you think it's important for the curriculum more broadly to be inclusive of queer and trans people's lives?
I think because there's a lot of like queer and trans people who are out there. Maybe they don't like know maybe, and like seeing it will help like give them a word for their identity or make them feel like they're being seen or they know who they get to understand who they are more rather than just focus on only like certain academic things and not like I don't know, I guess stuff about identity.
Um, so in that Intro to LGBTQ Studies class, was there anything else that you wanted to learn about after taking that class that you wished would have been, well, not, how do I put this? That, in the space of one semester, you can only cover so many topics, right? So, what else do you want to learn about when it comes to LGBTQ studies and people's lives and culture and literature and all of that?
I think learning more about the history would be interesting, like maybe farther back, like where they're like queer people like that like did they like differentiate? Like how did they feel about it in different cultures maybe? Because this course is pretty like modern-ish, within like I guess the last like 100 years or so. But I know it's only an intro class, but also one thing I was hoping to see was like um ace and aromantic like representation. Like we read through the textbook and it was more just LGBT, and they also included the I. It was like where's the A? And so I was hoping for it, but I mean, I guess it's just an intro. It was only one summer semester. It also wasn't in the textbook, and they like I think they might have mentioned it once, um, but yeah, I was hoping to learn about that.
Yeah, it's often the case that I think asexual, aromantic, and intersex people's experiences are kind of left out of a queer curriculum. And there's also like this generational divide too, where younger people are identifying, I think, more as ace and aromantic, and older people it didn't feel like as much of an option, right? So there's fewer people who identify that way who are older, fewer people who find community among other people who identify that way who are older. And so then when it comes to the classroom, there's this way that you can sort of like forget about that kind of the asexual or aromantic experience. And the intersex experience as well is often not covered very much. Um, oh, was the Asian American queer experience covered in that class?
Um, no, I don't. remember. I like, but it was um I think it might have been like mentioned in like intersectional identities. I guess I just kind of put it into there because of that. Through like some of the assignments or discussions are like, what about your experience? And so I just kind of threw my own experience out there.
Is that something that would feel meaningful to you or important to you to sort of be taking a class that at least focuses in part on Asian American queer experiences?
I think that would be an interesting class. I feel like it might be like very specific. Um, and I don't know, maybe like at like after you take intro, like maybe there's another class that you get to learn about because I know there's like Asian American studies or like different studies out there, like African American studies. Um, Maybe just like a course about like cultural like queer people in different cultures or I don't know, different identities.
So, what's been your experience with classroom participation and belonging? Do you know what I mean when I say that?
Like in general,
Yeah, just very generally. I know I went very broad all of a sudden.
um, I generally felt pretty like welcomed. Um, just as a like student, I think like the area that like I go to school at very diverse, and so it's not like I'm the only Asian person there. Um, and I think it's a little difficult to meet new people maybe or like actually get to know them. Maybe it's just because I haven't like really made the like really strong effort to like talk to everyone around me. But it's like you have an hour and a half of a class maybe, and then you like go to another class, and then it's not like high school. It's like pretty small where you might like probably gonna run into like a lot of the same people. Here it's like very different like group each class. So it's a little difficult, but I mean I haven't like really felt like I don't belong or like don't feel included. So it's like pretty nice atmosphere overall. And a little bit outside the classroom, um, at like my school, there's the Pride Center, um, and at first it's like in the Center for Inclusion and Belonging, and there's like a little office area, and you have to walk through it to get to the Pride Center. And so I was a little like hesitant to go through at first because I was like, oh, I have to go through like a couple of doors. Like, do I want to do that? But they've had like tables outside stands saying, "Oh, you should go check out the like Pride Center," and I can see the sign through the window. And so one day I just decided to go in, and it's a like nice office room, and it's just meant to be a place where queer students or faculty can just like hang out, maybe like get a snack, do your homework. But it's a nice atmosphere.
So, what do you think faculty can do to make queer and trans students feel more respected in the classroom in general?
That's an interesting question. I think maybe I've had some teachers ask like, oh, like if you guys like go by a different name or like want to use like certain pronouns. But it was a little off-putting, I feel like, because then you'd have to be like the only one to like say, oh, I use like these pronouns, because it's not like she asked like every single person, oh, like just say your name and pronouns. But it was like if you like go want to go by certain ones. I feel like if you're not very outgoing or like open about it, I guess it might be like harder and like a little scary to be like, oh, my name is this and I go by these pronouns, which is like I guess like well, because she was like calling out the names of the kids, and so of the students, and
Sorry.
um and I mean, I was when I heard that, I was thinking like, oh, I don't know if I would like want to like say it if I like use like any other pronouns, and so I was like, so um, and also in the online classes, I feel like it's easier because like in your like Canvas, you can put like, oh, these are my pronouns like right next to your name, and I think it's really like nice to see that because sometimes when I'm going through, I just see like the names, right? And then out of nowhere, I just see, oh, this person like actually put down their pronouns. Like I feel like it just makes me smile because I'm like, okay, maybe you're queer, but maybe like a teacher required you to put it. But I think it's nice so that way you just like just know like how to refer to people. Um, Otherwise, respect wise in the classroom,
Okay, can we start over there? So why do you think it's important to have faculty who represent your identities?
I think it's pretty important to have professors who can uh, either be queer or like Asian American because I'm Asian, and like both would be like really insane. Um, I think it would just be really easy to like talk to them, to maybe like if you have any like issues with anything, it's like easier to talk to someone who you can maybe relate to, and so you know like, oh, they probably can understand me, even if it's like not related to like being queer or Asian. Like maybe, oh, I'm having trouble in the class. It's easier to approach when you kind of know like the professor on like a more personal level. Like, okay, I at least know like they're queer, and then like I don't know, the Asian American, and I can just relate to them. I can talk to them. I can talk about any issues I have with like maybe outside of school or like anything that's happening on campus. Yeah.
So have you ever felt harassed or discriminated against because of your queerness or your other identities while in high school or in college?
I have not. I'm happy to say.
Oh, actually, before you said, so I forgot to ask this follow-up question. You said that you were hesitant to go into the Pride Center because you had to go in through a couple of doors. Why do you think you were hesitant?
Um, it just looked like because it's just a new campus, and I'm like I've never been inside that entire room before. I don't know what it's like. Um, and then also I didn't like I had like other things to do. I was like, oh, I had to like go study or stuff. But it was like after one class finished, I was like, okay, I have time before my next class, so I should just go check it out.
So have you had the experience of your professors asking students in general to share their pronouns as well as the professor sharing their own pronouns with the class?
So could you say that?
So have you had an experience, have you been in a class and the professor has asked all of the students to share their pronouns? And has the professor also shared their pronouns?
Uh, yeah, I think I've had like one or two, but it was like online. Um, and so I think it was just like the introduction post in the discussion where you like introduce yourself, say, oh, my name and pronouns. But I don't really remember a lot because I know some of my classes like this semester, I we just really didn't have any introductions. It was just like, all right, we're going into the content, you guys. So
It's always strange to me when that there's no chance to introduce yourself in a class. But
I don't have
so,
friends in those classes now.
why do you think it's important to for professors to ask students to share their pronouns and for them to share their pronouns as well?
I think having the professor share their own not only just makes it like maybe when they introduce themselves, say, "Oh, I'm Professor blah blah," and these are my pronouns, and then you're like, okay, well, I guess that's like kind of just what's expected now, so it's not like strange. And I guess if everyone else does it, it's not like really hard or like out of the ordinary or like you have to do a little extra step.
Um, so you haven't been at CRC for that long, but is there anything you can think of that you think the college could do to make trans and queer students feel more included on campus, and maybe queer and trans students of color in particular?
Um, I think it's already like pretty nice because the people who I've met who I believe are like working in the Pride Center are also people of color. So I thought that was really cool to see when I first came in.
So, what kind of community do you seek out while in college?
I haven't really been seeking out any community really. I guess the biggest step has been like um, joining like a couple clubs. Like and then I signed up for like the newsletter for the Pride Center. I just like go in there I guess a couple times. Um, Otherwise I feel like I've been hanging out with like some of maybe my friends from like before from high school and stuff who also go to CRC and just some other friend groups like maybe they do go to like other schools but because like they're not their school hasn't started yet so they're still in the area. I think that's more my community, but I've also joined like the outdoors club on campus. I haven't like done like any of the events yet, but I'm looking forward to doing it because it sounds really fun.
Do they go hiking?
Yeah, they go hiking. I think they went like kayaking last week.
That's a great club.
Yeah. Um,
Do they accept professors? I'm just kidding.
Maybe.
um, so, how important do you think community is for your sort of sense of belonging and investment in your college education?
Me personally, I feel like it's like a personal preference of mine. I'm like content where I am usually. I'm not like I don't really feel the need to like go out and find like a I have to find friends in like every single class. I'm like I don't like need like to find someone to like stick to in every single class or a community because I'm pretty like happy with like with the people I am friends with. But I think it like the reason why I joined like some of the clubs, like I also joined the transfer like communities or like transfer from community college to another school. There's like a club for that. So I joined that so that way it's not only helps me like know the people who are transferring, but also just so I know the information about like what it's like to transfer.
How did you find out about those two clubs?
Um, on the website for like CRC, I was interested in like some of the clubs, so I was just like going through. And then they also had like a club fair sort of thing, except it was 2 days, and on the second day, which is the day that I had time to come, like there weren't like a lot of the tables out, so I had to. I found that's how I found the transfer club, but for the outdoors club, I didn't see them there, so I had to like email someone. But then I did join. So
So, is there anything in general that you would like professors to know in particular about what they can do in the classroom to help you learn, to help you succeed?
I can't think of anything really.
Has there been anything in previous classes that you've really kind of you've liked that you'd like to see replicated in future and other classes that you take?
Um, I know in high school some of my teachers were very good with communicating with the students and asking like, oh, like is like the students were able to say, we have like this school-wide event that's going to be going on. We probably like shouldn't have the test on that day and stuff like that. I think communication between I know it's going to be different at like the college level because it's more like of a broad audience. It's not like everyone's doing the exact same events. Um, but I think communication with the students is nice, um, which I know is hard for like some classes, but it is nice when you get to know like your professor.
Are you taking all your classes in person right now?
Yes, I specifically wanted in-person classes.
And why did you, I know you said over the summer you were taking online classes only, but why do you feel like it's important for your education to take in-person classes?
Um, I think you get to ask questions like in real time, or it just gets you out of like, or else I would have just been sitting in my room. And I think being at like a school, being just out of my house, just like gives me a better atmosphere to work and study in rather than being a little too comfortable at home and then have like the all the temptation of like I could just go get a snack and like eat and I don't know watch shows, but when you're here, it's kind of like I'm in class. I'm gonna be like learning, and it helps me stay focused.
Okay, so just a couple of wrap-up questions. What makes you, when you think about your future as a college student, what makes you most excited?
Um, I think there's gonna be a lot of interesting classes. I think just it's such a big difference from high school to college. I feel like in terms of how the professors feel more like they like feel passionate or like they go more in depth rather than like hitting like a certain like curriculum. I feel like in college you get to actually be more interested because my chemistry class, my professor is very into chemistry. He like talks about it like he just loves it a lot, and it's cool to see like passion. And then you're like, okay, it's a little more interesting. Even if like it's a hard class, I get to like at least like feel a little bit of enthusiasm, so I can kind of bounce off of that and helps me be more motivated.
So I think we're at the end. I'm sure there are more questions I can ask, but is there anything you would like to add or questions you would like to return to?
No.
All right, thank you.